Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Neuroscience of Mental Health. Today is lesson 4, the 4 characters. We're going to learn a little bit about the anatomy of the brain today, and we're going to give you some characters to think about different parts of the brain that help us to respond to challenge. We're going to introduce the characters because they make it a lot easier to remember the goal of each part of the brain. So we'll first introduce the anatomy. We have two systems in our brain. We have a two-system brain. There's a famous book, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, and it talks about how we have kind of two different parts of our brain, one that's in charge of thinking fast and one that's in charge of thinking slow. That fast part of our brain is to help us get out of the way of the danger. It's sort of that gut reaction, do it, just go. When you're playing sports and you're the goalie and the ball gets kicked at you, you just move. You know that movement. So that's the thinking fast part. The thinking slow part of the brain is the analytic thinking, is the when you're taking a math test, you're using that part of the brain that thinks pretty slowly and analytically and hopefully has your highest level thinking involved. Um, I read a book called Out of Character by David DeSteno and Pier Carlo Baldasolo, and they have a different way of looking at those two systems of the brain. They actually are psychologists out of Boston, and for a living, they put people into moral dilemmas and see how they respond. And they said, yes, there are two systems of the brain. And often when we think of decisions we make, we think of good versus bad. We think of the decisions, some that are good for us, some that are bad for us. And they said, you can't really think about it that way. So they think about good and bad are kind of like an angel and a devil. If anybody's watched Fred Flintstone videos, he often has an angel pop up over one shoulder and a devil pop up over the other one, kind of saying, do it, do it, do it. Don't do it, don't do it. And David DeSteno and Pier Carlo Baldasolo, in their experience, found out that they said it's not an angel and a devil. We don't make decisions based on good and bad. We make decisions based on time frame. So instead of an angel and a devil, they talk about an ant and a grasshopper. That in the two systems, the slow thinking brain is in charge of our long-term decisions, thinking about things that are going to benefit us in the long run. And our fast thinking brain is in charge of thinking about the things that are going to help us here and now. And so we're going to learn about those systems. Here's the anatomy of the brain. This is what our brain kind of looks like. Not really those colors, but if you look in the center of the brain, the blue section is called the limbic system, and the red section also is actually a part of that. That's the limbic system. That's the emotional part of our brain, where when we feel happy, sad, excited, anxious, nervous, all of that stuff is in the limbic system of the brain. And that's our fast system, and that's also our short-term system. It's in charge of short-term survival and short-term what's going on in the here and now. The gray part is the long-term thinking, the slow thinking brain. That is the in charge of our long-term decisions. We are going to introduce 4 characters to you, and they are kind of in their places of the brain right now. The ant represents the long-term decisions. He's in the cortex up there. The grasshopper is in the limbic system. He represents the fast-thinking brain, and the one who's in charge of the here and now. The glowworm is in the amygdala, which is part of the limbic system. She's in charge of looking out for danger. We're going to introduce her. And the dragonfly kind of lives outside the brain, or in the prefrontal cortex, the highest level thinking, and she's in charge of kind of overriding the glowworm, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So first off, we'll look at the ant. Again, he's in charge of our long-term thinking. We're going to introduce his tools in another lesson. These are the things that keep our brain healthy. The ant is in charge of our long-term decisions, putting money in the bank, eating healthy, going to the doctor, studying for the test, all those things that are going to benefit you in the future. The grasshopper is in charge of our short-term survival. He doesn't really care how you do on that test next week. He just wants to eat chips and watch Netflix. He's the one that when at the end of the Netflix, it says 3, 2, 1, he's saying, let's do another one, let's do another one. He wants to go outside and play. He just really doesn't care about the future. He's in charge of the here and now, but he's also the one that's in charge of getting us out of the way of the oncoming car. And that last, the fight, flight, or freeze with him with his arms up in the air, that's part of the grasshopper job. The glowworm is in charge of looking out for dangers. She's in the amygdala, the limbic system of the brain. And our brain, our number one goal is survival. So she's in charge of looking out. If that car is coming towards us, she's going to go red alert. And it's her job to switch the brain from the ant to the grasshopper so that we can jump out of the way of the car. This is an example of her. When she goes red alert, grasshopper comes out for fight, flight, or freeze. We're able to get out of the way of the oncoming car. If we were in the cortex of the brain, we could never do that. And the dragonfly is in charge of mindfulness, understanding what's going on, and being able to recognize when we don't want to switch control of the brain, when we want to stay in that analytic, slow thinking part of the brain that helps us out sometimes in the here and now. We'll be explaining in other lessons what kind of makes the glowworm go red alert and why it is so important to have that dragonfly in control. And she has those 4 S's on her wings to remind us that we have those strategies to respond, that we know about our self-supports. We talked about that with Chris Waddell last time. So those are the 4 characters. The ant is in charge of our long-term decisions, grasshopper short-term, glowworm looking out for danger, and dragonfly mindfulness. We're going to go into greater detail, but today was just an overview to let you know about where those characters are in the anatomy of the brain and what they stand for. Your reflection for the next couple of days. The characters are a fun way to understand your brain and its systems. In the next few days, try to recognize which you are feeding. Which do you think you're feeding? Like when you're studying and you're working hard, you're feeding that ant. When you're eating healthy, all the things with the ant tools, and we'll go over that. But think about how often you're feeding the ant part of the brain and how often you're feeding the grasshopper brain, because they're both important, but the importance is that we are balancing and that we're feeding both. All right, we'll see you soon.